The dust on Draventh never truly settled. It hung in the air like smoke that forgot to rise, coating the compound walls in a thin red film and turning the afternoon light into something that looked almost like sunset even at midday. The human prisoners had stopped noticing it after the first week. The guards had stopped noticing it after the first year. Nobody on this rock noticed much of anything anymore, which was exactly how Reed preferred it. He sat against the eastern wall of the courtyard with his back straight and his hands loose in his lap, not folded, not fidgeting, just resting like a man with nowhere to go and nothing to think about. Around him, the other prisoners moved through their break time the usual way, eating, arguing in low voices, staring at the ground. The Varath guards stood at their posts with the bored weight of beings who had done this job too long to find it interesting. Reed counted them anyway, 7 on duty, 2 near the main gate, 1 on the north walkway, 1 on the south, 2 flanking the tunnel entrance, and guard Captain Grail standing near the water trough with his arms folded and his pale eyes moving slowly around the yard. Grail always moved his eyes slowly. He was the kind of creature who believed that deliberate watching was more useful than quick watching. Reed had noticed that about him in the first week. Reed had been here 4 months. In those 4 months, he had learned the shift schedule, the patrol gaps, the layout of 3 sublevels he had never physically entered, the location of the communication array on the upper tier, and the name of every single guard who had ever worked this compound. He had done all of this by sitting still, staying quiet, and giving everyone around him absolutely nothing to look at. He was very good at being nothing to look at. The shift horn was still 20 minutes away when he heard the small sound from above. Not a footstep, more like a claw tip dragging briefly against stone. He did not look up. He let his eyes stay where they were, on the middle distance, on nothing, while his ears tracked the sound moving along the edge of the upper residential tier and then going quiet. Then a shape dropped into the courtyard from the gap between the supply shed and the eastern wall. It landed with a soft double thump, the sound of something young that had not yet fully learned how to be quiet. Reed kept his eyes forward. He heard it breathe. Then he heard something else, a small dry rustle, like paper being smoothed flat. He looked. She was small for a Varath, which meant she came up to about Reed's shoulder when standing. Her scales were a deep, vivid scarlet with a silver underside that caught the afternoon light in a way that made her look briefly like something on fire. She was sitting cross-legged near the base of the eastern wall, close enough that Reed could have reached out and touched her, and she had a sketchbook open across her knees. She was not looking at the yard. She was looking at him. Reed did not move. He did not speak. He did not change his expression. He simply sat there, the same way he had been sitting there, and let her look. She looked for a long time. Then she lowered her eyes to the sketchbook and began to draw. The pencil made a soft, scratching sound. Around the courtyard, none of the other prisoners had noticed her yet. Guard Captain Grail had turned toward the tunnel entrance and was speaking to one of the guards there. The hatchling was in a blind spot between 2 walls, tucked into the angle of afternoon shadow, and she clearly knew it. She had done this before. Reed watched her without turning his head, using his peripheral vision the way he had taught himself to years ago. She drew with focus. Her head tilted when she was studying something and tilted the other direction when she was putting it to paper. She had the kind of concentration that children have when they care about something completely and have not yet learned to be embarrassed about caring. The shift horn went off 20 minutes later. She startled, closed the sketchbook in one smooth motion, and scrambled back up the wall with the quick, sure movements of someone who had made this climb many times. She was gone before the echo of the horn faded. Reed stood with the other prisoners and lined up for the return march to the holding pens. He walked in the middle of the group, the same place he always walked, and kept his face relaxed. That evening, when the lights in the pen dimmed and the other prisoners were settling into sleep, he moved to sit beside a woman near the back wall. Her name was Nira, and she had been an engineer before the Varath took Draventh. She was one of the few people in this compound whose eyes were still sharp. "The hatchling who comes through the eastern gap," Reed said very quietly. "Whose is she?" Nira looked at him. She had learned not to ask why Reed asked things. "Warden's daughter," she said, "comes down sometimes. I've seen her sketching bugs and lizards. The guards look the other way because she's the warden's." How old? Young, 20 cycles, maybe, which for them is like a child of 10 for us. Reed nodded slowly and said nothing more. Nera watched him. Why? He settled back against the wall. She sat near me today, drew something. And nothing, Reed said, just noticing. He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep for a long time. In his mind, he was mapping the gap in the eastern wall, the angle of the shadow, and the exact position in the courtyard where a person could sit very still and hear a hatchling talk to herself while she drew. Noticing, he thought again, that was all it was. She came back the next day. She appeared in the same spot at the same time, settled herself in the same wedge of shadow, opened the sketchbook, and looked at Reed for a long moment before she started drawing. Reed was already sitting against the eastern wall. He had been there for 10 minutes before she arrived, not because he planned to be, but because that was where he always sat during break time. He told himself it was coincidence. He was good at lying to himself when he needed to. On the third day, she tilted her head to one side, studying him with one eye half closed the way artists do when they are measuring something. Without thinking, Reed turned his face very slightly to the right, giving her a different angle. She made a small sound, not quite a word, more like a hum of satisfaction, and started drawing faster. He had not meant to do that. He noted it and let it go. By the seventh day, she was experimenting. She would tilt her own head, and Reed would understand somehow that she wanted him to hold still in a particular way, and he would hold that way without being asked. She never spoke. He never spoke. The arrangement had a logic to it that neither of them had discussed, which made it, in Reed's experience, more solid than most agreements. He listened to everything. She talked to herself while she drew, not to him, to herself, in the half-mumbling way that young creatures have when they are thinking out loud and not monitoring their own mouths. She spoke in the Varath common tongue, which Reed understood well and had been careful to never reveal that he understood. She talked about her drawings, about which angle she liked better, about whether the dust in the air changed the color of things. She talked about her lunch. She talked about her father's schedule. She talked about her father's schedule the way a child complains about a parent being busy, not as information, just as the background noise of her life. But she was specific in the way that children are specific, because children have not yet learned that details are dangerous. Reed sat very still and memorized every word. The council meeting happened on the third day of every 8-day rotation. The senior staff ate in the upper hall on those nights, and the residential tier went quiet by the third hour past dark. The communication array, she called it, the tall buzzing thing, made a different sound on those nights because her father kept it active through the meal. The supply ships came on the second day of each rotation without fail, always in the morning, always through the northern gate. Reed built a map in his mind, not just of walls and corridors, but of rhythms and gaps, the invisible architecture of a place. He sent fragments of it out every 3 days in the dust patterns near the water trough, in arrangements so subtle that they looked like nothing to anyone who was not looking for something specific. The resistance reconnaissance drones swept the sector on a fixed cycle. He had counted it from sound twice. On the 12th day, Nera found him by the water trough at the end of the evening meal and leaned close under the pretense of reaching past him. "You need to tell me what you're doing," she said. Her voice was barely above breath. "Working," Reed said. "You're running something. I've been watching you for weeks." She straightened up. "I used to route communications for a forward base before this. I know what it looks like when someone is running signals." Reed looked at her sideways. She held his gaze without flinching. He had been watching her too, for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when a person stopped waiting and started pushing. He had been waiting to see if she would push well or push badly. She pushed well. "Walk with me," he said. They circled the yard slowly, like two bored people stretching their legs. He told her enough. Not everything, never everything, but enough. There was a plan. She had a role in it if she wanted it. The plan was already moving. The hatchling was not the plan, but the hatchling had become part of the plan's foundation without either of them knowing it, and Reed was not going to explain all of what that meant right now. Nera was quiet for a full circuit of the yard. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Not yet, he said. Soon. On the 17th day, when the shift horn was still a few minutes away, the hatchling did something she had not done before. She closed the sketchbook and held it out toward Reed with both hands, open to a page. He looked at it. It was him. It was him from 7 different angles on the same page, small and precise, with the compound wall behind him in each one. She had captured something in the set of his shoulders, a stillness that was not laziness, something that her young eyes had seen and her hands had known how to record without anyone telling her what it was. Reed looked at it for a moment. He looked at her. "You are very good," he said. Her silver underscaled face did something that he thought might be a smile. She closed the book, tucked it under her arm, and disappeared up the wall before the horn finished its note. Reed stayed sitting. Nira passed by him heading back to the work line and said nothing, just glanced at him once. He did not return the glance. He was thinking about the drawing, about the fact that she had looked at him every day for 17 days and had seen, with complete accuracy, the one thing he worked hardest to hide. The stillness that was not laziness. He was going to have to be careful. She asked him a question on the 21st day. She had been mid-sketch, pencil moving in quick short strokes, and she stopped without warning and looked at him directly and said, "Why don't you have scales?" Reed considered this. "My kind doesn't grow them," he said. She frowned. "What protects you?" "Other things." She seemed unsatisfied with that answer, but returned to drawing. 3 minutes later, she stopped again. "Does it hurt? The air here? My father says the air is different for your kind." "We adjust," Reed said. She nodded slowly, filing this away. The next day she came with a small question about his hands, specifically why the fingers bent the way they did and whether it hurt to draw with them. He told her it did not hurt. She asked if he could draw. He said a little. She offered him the pencil with an expression of such genuine interest that Reed almost laughed, which was not something that happened to him often. He drew a simple thing, a box, a wall, a door, nothing useful, nothing that revealed anything. She studied it with the focused seriousness of a craftsman examining another craftsman's work, then said, "Your lines are uncertain," with complete honesty and no cruelty at all, and took the pencil back. These conversations became part of the arrangement. She asked, he answered in short, careful truths. He learned her name during one of these exchanges, Sora, when she told him that she had drawn everything in the upper tier and was moving to the lower compound because there was more to see there. He asked how she chose subjects. She said, "Things that don't move too much. Movement is hard. You are easy because you never move unless I want you to." He noted that she had said, "unless I want you to." He had thought he was making small choices. She had been directing him. Children, he reminded himself, were not always what they seemed, even innocent ones. On the 28th day, she mentioned the gathering. She was annoyed about it, which was why she mentioned it. Her father was hosting a meeting of 4 sector wardens. She said this the way a child says that a parent's important dinner guests are ruining her week, and for the 4 days around the gathering, the lower compound would be on restricted movement, which meant she could not come. "How long?" Reed asked. 4 days, maybe 5 if they argue. She scowled at the sketchbook. "They always argue. Last time the warden of the 2nd sector stayed 2 extra days and ate everything." Reed kept his face still. 4 sector wardens in one room on one planet at one time. He did not know precisely what they would discuss. He did not need to know. The Resistance had people who would know exactly what to do with that signal if they could intercept it. The question was whether intercepting it was possible. The communication array, the tall buzzing thing, was active during all senior council meetings. He knew this from Sora's own mouth. The array scrambled signals from the warden's hall during those sessions, which meant nothing could get in or out clearly, except the scrambler relay was a physical piece of equipment. Physical equipment could be touched. He found Nira that evening. "There's a relay unit somewhere in the maintenance tunnels," he said. "Secondary level, most likely behind the east junction. It handles signal scrambling for the upper hall. Can you find it?" Nira was quiet for a moment. I run the East Junction inspection on the first day of each rotation, she said slowly. I've seen the unit, never had a reason to touch it. You will have a reason soon. Can you disable it for a window, 20 minutes, 30 if possible? What happens in that window? Someone listens. She turned that over. The sector warden's meeting, she said. It was not a question. She had quick math, Nira did. We need a distraction during the meeting day. Something that pulls Grail's extra rotation toward the lower tunnel and away from the maintenance access. That's not the hard part, Nira said. The hard part is that if Grail is already watching you, a distraction that happens to run while you're sitting in the yard will not look like nothing. I won't be the distraction, Reed said. I'll be sitting in the yard. She studied him, and the distraction will just happen on its own. Two men in Block C have been wanting to settle an argument for 3 weeks. I've been making sure they didn't. I'll stop making sure. She was quiet for long enough that Reed began to think she was going to refuse. Then she exhaled through her nose. 20 minutes, she said. I can give you 20. After that, the system will flag the relay fault. 20 is enough, he said. 2 days later, Grail stopped Reed in the yard, just stopped him, stepped into his path and stood there. He was tall for a Varath, broad through the chest, with the flat, patient eyes of a predator that was not in a hurry. He studied Reed for a moment, as if reading something written small. You have been here 4 months, Grail said. Yes, Reed said. You have not once been cited for disruption, not once been late to account, not once complained or asked for anything. Reed nodded. Every other man in this compound has done at least one of those things, Grail said, even the quiet ones. I'm patient, Reed said. Grail's eyes stayed on him. I have been doing this work for 11 years, he said. The prisoners I worry about are never the loud ones. He stepped aside and let Reed pass. Reed walked on at the same pace. He counted his breaths until he was around the corner. Then he let himself think about what had just happened, measured it carefully, and filed it away. Grail was not guessing. Grail was building something in his mind. He just did not have enough pieces yet. Reed needed the warden's meeting to happen before Grail found more pieces. The morning of the sector warden's meeting came in grey and close, the kind of day where the dust hung low and the red light never quite made it through. Reed woke before the count horn and lay still on his bunk for a few minutes, running through everything one more time, not because he was uncertain, because the habit of checking kept mistakes from hiding. He knew what Grail had done. 3 days ago, the guard captain had added 2 extra bodies to the morning rotation and positioned one of them at a permanent post beside the maintenance tunnel entrance. The post looked routine. It was not routine. Grail was closing gaps he had identified, which meant Grail had identified approximately the right gaps. Which meant the operation was running exactly at the edge of possible. Reed found this neither alarming nor reassuring. It simply was what it was, and what it was had already been accounted for. At midday, during the extraction work shift, a fight broke out in Block C's section of the lower tunnel. It was loud and physical and involved 2 men who had been carrying a genuine argument for weeks and had simply today stopped being patient with each other. 4 guards moved toward it immediately. 2 more were called from the perimeter. Grail, who was in the upper yard, turned toward the sound and then made a decision that Reed had expected him to make. He went down himself, because Grail was the kind of commander who went where the noise was. The extra post by the maintenance tunnel was left with 1 guard instead of 2. Nira was already in position. She had a legitimate reason to be in the maintenance corridor. She always did, and she moved through it with the unhurried walk of a woman going about her assigned work. She reached the relay unit in 4 minutes. She opened the access panel. She had studied this unit for 3 days during her inspection rounds, had memorized every connection, and now she worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years as an engineer before a war had interrupted her. 9 minutes after she started, the relay dropped out of active mode. It would not flag a fault for another 11 minutes at minimum. Above the compound, in the low orbit that passed over Draventh's eastern plateau every third day, a resistance signals unit caught the gap and pushed a passive receiver into it. 23 minutes of unscrambled transmission from the warden's hall flowed outward into waiting ears. Reed sat in the yard. He sat in the eastern shadow at his usual spot and did not watch the tunnel entrance and did not look toward the maintenance corridor and did not check the upper tier. He was a man with nowhere to go and nothing to think about. 2 guards passed him without a second look. A third slowed briefly, and Reed held his breathing at the same pace, and the guard moved on. The fight in Block C ended. It had run longer than Reed intended, because one of the men had hit harder than expected, but it ended without anyone being seriously hurt. 4 guards returned to their positions. Grail came back up into the upper yard with mud on his boots and an expression that said he found the entire situation beneath him. Nira reappeared at the water trough 11 minutes after the relay came back online. She did not look at Reed. She filled her water cup and walked back toward the Block B work line. Reed allowed himself, very briefly, to feel something like relief. Then Grail put a hand on the shoulder of a man named Dort and walked him away from the work line, and Reed's relief ended. Dort was one of the 2 men from Block C. He was also the man Reed had quietly asked to make sure the argument happened today and not on some other day. Dort did not know why Reed had asked, only that Reed had asked, and Dort had trusted him enough to do it. He did not know anything that could expose the relay or Nira or the signal intercept, but he knew Reed had asked him for something, and Grail was now asking him questions. Reed watched from the yard. He kept his face neutral and his hands loose, and he watched Grail speak quietly to Dort for a long time. Dort's shoulders stayed tight the whole time. That was either guilt or fear, and from Grail's angle, both looked the same. Grail let Dort go eventually. He did not arrest him. He turned and walked back toward the upper tier, and Reed had just enough time to look away before Grail's gaze swept the yard in a slow, deliberate arc. That night in the holding pen, Reed sat against the far wall and did not speak to anyone. Nira came and sat a few feet away, not beside him, just nearby. After a long time, she said very quietly, "It went through. I could feel the relay cycle back. Whatever they needed to hear, they heard it." Reed nodded once. "Dort," she asked. "Doesn't know enough to hurt us," Reed said. "Grail got a thread, not a rope." "Grail's smart." "Yes. We are running out of time." Reed looked at his hands in the dim light. He had been running operations like this for 8 years, in places worse than this, against smarter opponents than Grail. He knew what it felt like when the edge got closer. He knew the difference between a thread and a rope. He also knew that sometimes threads were enough to pull the whole thing loose. "We have some time," he said. What he did not say was how much. He was not sure yet. And Reed had learned long ago that admitting uncertainty was something you did when you had people who could afford to hear it. Nira could not afford it right now. So he said nothing more, and after a while she moved away, and the lights went dim, and Reed sat in the near dark and calculated how many days they had left. He counted 3, maybe 4, not more than that. Sora came back 3 days after the warden's meeting. She was quieter than usual. The gathering had unsettled the whole upper tier in ways she was too young to fully understand, and it had settled into her the way big, heavy things settle into small spaces, by making the space feel different without changing anything visible. She dropped into the courtyard and opened her sketchbook without the usual small sounds of arrangement, just sat and looked at Reed and started drawing. Reed let her work. He sat the way he always sat. He counted the guards on their rotation, noted that Grail's extra post by the maintenance tunnel had been quietly removed, and listened to the sound of the pencil moving across paper. She had a new sketchbook. The old one was full. After a long time, she said, "Were things loud in here during the meeting days?" "There was a fight," Reed said. She made a small disapproving sound. She did not like the compound he had gathered. She liked what was in it, the angles, the textures, the way light moved, but the fact of it troubled her in a way she had not found words for yet. When the shift horn was still a few minutes away, she did something that she had not done before. She set her current sketchbook aside and reached into the bag she carried and pulled out a different one. Older, more worn, with a strap holding it closed. She opened it and held it out to Reed. He took it. He understood within 4 seconds what he was holding. He understood within 10 seconds that it was the most complete ground-level intelligence map of this compound that he had ever seen, rendered not in symbols and notation, but in precise, beautiful drawings. The guard posts from 6 different angles. The supply gate with measurements she had estimated by counting her own steps. The tunnel entrances with their sight lines drawn in faint dotted arcs. The upper tier layout from a view only possible from her residential window. The position of the communication array against the background of the surrounding hills, accurate enough that a targeting system could have used it. She had been drawing the whole compound for weeks. She was proud of it. She was showing him her work. She said, "I am going to draw all of Draventh eventually. My father says I have his eye for land." Reed held the sketchbook in both hands and looked at it. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea what she was holding, what she had spent weeks creating, what it would mean to the people who were waiting for exactly this kind of information. She thought it was art. It was also, completely by accident, a weapon. He thought about what Commander Wynne would say if Reed described this sketchbook in a signal. He thought about the resistance strategists who had been trying to plan a compound strike for 6 months without enough ground data. He thought about the prisoners in the holding pens and what a precise strike plan could mean for them. He thought about how easily he could lift this sketchbook and find a way to pass it along, and how well it would serve the mission, and how completely and utterly Sora had trusted him without knowing who he was or what he was doing. He was still thinking this through when the shadow fell across both of them. Grail stood at the edge of the eastern wall. He was not wearing his usual expression of deliberate patience. He was wearing something quieter than that, and quieter was worse. His eyes moved from Reed to Sora to the open sketchbook in Reed's hands, and he made the connection in the same 4 seconds that Reed had. "Sora," Grail said carefully, "what are you showing him?" "My compound drawings," she said, with the complete confidence of a child who has done nothing wrong. "I've been doing the whole layout. Reed says I'm very good." Grail looked at Reed. Reed looked at Grail. There was a full second of silence, in which both of them understood exactly what this moment was, and neither of them moved. Then Grail stepped forward, and Reed felt the decision arrive the way decisions arrive when there is truly only one of them available, fully, without announcement, without drama. He closed the sketchbook and held it back out to Sora. Grail stopped. Sora took the sketchbook with both hands, confused by the sudden tension, but not yet alarmed. "Those are hers," Reed said to Grail. His voice was level and completely ordinary. "Her drawings, her work." "Step away from the prisoner," Grail said to Sora. Sora did not move. She held the sketchbook against her chest and looked up at Grail with the expression of someone who has been interrupted while doing something good and does not understand why. "I was showing Reed my drawings," she said. "Sora," Grail's voice sharpened slightly, "this is not." "You are being very rude," Sora said. In the Varath social structure, a warden's daughter's word was not nothing. Grail knew this. The sharpness left his voice, but his eyes stayed on Reed, and what was in them had hardened past suspicion into something close to certainty. He could not take the sketchbook from the warden's daughter in the middle of the compound without starting a conversation with Durath that he was not ready to have. Not yet, not without more. He stepped back. "I will speak to your father," he told her, and walked away. Sora watched him go with an expression of pure irritation, then turned back to Reed. Reed was looking at the sketchbook in her arms, at what he had handed back. "He is always like that," she said, stiff. "He is doing his job," Reed said quietly. She studied him with the same focused look she used when she was measuring something for a drawing. "Are you going to be in trouble?" Reed looked at her. "No," he said. "You should go, take that with you and keep it safe." She tucked the sketchbook tighter under her arm and climbed back up the wall. Reed watched her go. Then he stood and walked toward the water trough and stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at nothing, while the thing he had just done settled into him. Nearer appeared at his shoulder. "You had it in your hands," she said, almost a whisper. "Yes. You gave it back." "Yes." A long pause. Was that the right call? Reed turned away from the water trough. "Ask me when we're out of here," he said. Draventh summoned Reed the next morning. 2 guards came for him before the Count Horn, which was how the warden communicated that the conversation was not optional and that the hour was deliberate. Reed walked between them through corridors he had never physically entered, mapping them out of habit, noting the distance from the upper hall to the northern gate and the placement of every door. The warden's hall was wide and high-ceilinged, with walls of dark stone that held the cold the way deep places do. Draventh stood near the far end. He was larger than Reed had expected. The Varath commander's scale plates were a deep, dark indigo that made him look almost like he had been carved from the same stone as the walls. Grail stood to one side with his arms folded and his pale eyes showing nothing. On the table between them was Sora's old sketchbook, the worn one with the strap. Draventh looked at Reed for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you a spy?" Reed had rehearsed a great many answers to a great many questions over 8 years. He had answers ready for this question. He had 3 of them, in fact, calibrated for different levels of proof and different kinds of interlocutors. He did not use any of them. "Yes," he said. Grail moved very slightly, the motion of someone who had expected to hear something else. Draventh did not move at all. "The relay disruption during my council meeting," Draventh said. "That was you." "The engineer, Neera. I planned it, she executed it. The signal your council transmitted that evening was intercepted by a resistance unit in low orbit." Reed kept his voice the same as it always was, level, unremarkable. "The information is already gone. That part is done." Draventh's eyes did not leave him. "And my daughter's sketchbook." This was the part Reed had been thinking about since the moment Grail had walked away from Sora in the courtyard. He had thought about it all night, turning it over, finding its edges. "The compound drawings she made," Reed said, "are more useful to a strike planner than anything else I have found in 4 months here. They are accurate, complete. She has her father's eye." He paused. "I gave them back to her." "Silence." "Why?" Draventh said. "Because she trusted me." Reed let that sit for a moment. "I understand what that sketchbook is worth. I also understand that she made it without knowing what it was, and that she showed it to me because she trusted me, and because she is a child who draws things she finds interesting, and she does not yet know that everything can be used as a weapon." He looked at Draventh steadily. "There are things I will not do, even in a war. She is one of them." Draventh was quiet for a very long time, long enough that Grail shifted his weight just once. Then the compound alarm went off. Not the shift horn, the full alarm, the deep, resonant pulse that meant the compound's outer sensors had detected something in the upper atmosphere. Reed heard it and felt something in his chest unlock that had been locked for 4 months. They had heard the intercept. They had acted on it. The resistance had hit the Varath fleet at its refueling coordinates, the coordinates that had been in the Sector Warden's Council transmission, and now a liberation force was burning through the atmosphere above Draventh's eastern plateau. For 3 seconds, nobody in the hall moved. Then Draventh said, "Grail, get Sora to the secure room." His voice had changed, not broken, just reset into something operational. "Now." Grail moved without another word. Reed stood in the hall. The 2 guards who had brought him had gone to the door, uncertain between staying on their post and responding to the alarm. He could leave. He could walk through the door and into the compound and be in the northern section before anyone organized a response, and Commander Wynn's team would find him there, and that would be the end of it. He thought about the holding pens, about the tunnel entrances and the sight lines and the angle of the eastern wall, and how a strike team coming in fast from the upper atmosphere would have, at best, partial information about where the prisoners were housed. He was already moving. Not toward the northern section, back into the compound, through the main corridor toward the block areas. He moved quickly and he moved openly because there was no longer any point in being quiet, and when the first guard tried to stop him, he said, "Your commander's daughter is in the secure room. Tell him the prisoner is routing the holding blocks to the northern yard for evacuation. Tell him it's clean, he'll know what that means." The guard stared at him. Reed did not stop moving. It took 11 minutes to move all 3 holding blocks into the northern yard in an organized way. Reed did this by walking through each block and speaking in a clear, calm voice and telling people exactly what to do and why. People moved when someone spoke to them with certainty. He had always known this. He had used it most of his career to gather information. It turned out it worked equally well for getting 300 frightened prisoners to move in an organized column toward an open gate. Commander Wynn's team came through the northern perimeter at the 12-minute mark. They found the prisoners already in the yard. They found Reed at the gate, standing next to a Varath guard who had stopped pointing his weapon sometime in the last 4 minutes and was now just standing there, confused. Wynn looked at Reed the way people look at something they expected to find broken. Reed looked back at her. "Neera is in Block B," he said. "She goes first." Later, in the quiet after the ceasefire took hold and the Varath began their withdrawal negotiations, and the compound changed hands without the full battle that everyone had expected, Reed sat against the eastern wall. Force of habit. He heard the small sound from above. He looked up. Sora was on the edge of the upper tier. She had her new sketchbook open, and she was drawing him with the focused, tilted head look that he knew by now meant she had found something worth capturing. He sat still. She climbed down eventually and crossed the yard and stood in front of him. She turned the sketchbook around. This drawing was different, not just a still man against a wall. Reed in the middle of the northern yard, other figures moving around him, his face turned slightly to the side and his hands open. She had drawn it from memory. From whatever she had seen from the upper tier during the evacuation. She had drawn him the way he actually was. He looked at it for a long time. "Now you know who I am," he said. Sora tilted her head. "I always knew who you were," she said. "I just didn't know what you did." Reed looked at her. He thought about saying something. He did not have anything that seemed right. "Keep drawing things," he said finally. She nodded very seriously, like she was accepting a charge. He stood, found Wynn waiting for him near the gate, and walked away. At the edge of the yard, he did not look back. He did not need to. He already knew exactly what she was doing.